Good morning again, and Grace Place. We're delighted you're here. Thank you so much for being in worship. And I wanted to just share with you a few things that I think are so very, very important. And we're going to be talking about a subject that I think all of us have our own set of challenges with, and that's the whole subject of fear. Any of you know what that feels like? Any? I figured you might. My wife's always wanted to go to England, and so a couple of years ago, I was doing this project in Spain, and so I told her, I said, if you'll go with me on this trip, then we'll fly over to England and spend a few days there, and so that's what we did. Now, you have to understand, I have a way of doing things that's uniquely my own. So we flew from Miami into Madrid, and from Madrid to Valencia, Spain, which is where I do this project. I'm doing this project. And then we flew from Valencia to England. Now, I know that's not the most direct path to England, but that's what we did. And there were a lot of good reasons for it. And so we land at Gatwick about, midnight or so, go through customs and everything you have to go through. And we got on the Gatwick Express, and we ended up in Victoria Station. Now, if you've ever been in England, in London, and Victoria Station, that's kind of like Central Station in New York City. And it's where all the trains and all the buses, everything come together. So by the time we get there, it's about 2:30 in the morning. And so we get off of the train, and I asked for directions to our hotel, which was like 3 blocks away from Victoria Station. Now, I've never been there before, but I know that that's what they tell me it is. And so I asked directions for it, and it wasn't from what Karen considered the most trustworthy source. And then at 2:30 in the morning, leaving Victoria Station, London's finest is not gathered outside the entrance. In fact, I would say the exact opposite is gathered there. And then we're walking, and we have roller boards in our backpacks, and all of my wife's country roots came to the surface, and she's telling me I'm going to get her killed. Whole bunch of things like that. And it didn't matter how many trips I've taken her on. Didn't matter, I brought her safely back home from every one of them. At that point in time, all she could think about was all of those people that were outside of Victoria Station. Well, we walked 3.5 blocks and we were at the hotel. All right, that's the good news. The reality is this: all of us have our own fears, all of us have our own phobias. And those fears and phobias we have in our lives create all kinds of challenges for us. And certainly, Jesus' disciples were not exempt from those fears and those phobias. And when you look at their lives, you realize very quickly that they were dealing with all of the same kinds of fears and emotions that you and I deal with in our lives. In 1933, in the middle of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt made this statement in one of his political speeches. And it's a pretty famous statement. It goes like this: that the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. Now, that may be a fantastic, line in some political speech, but absolutely as far off base as it could be. In fact, they did a study of 500 people to see what kinds of fears they had, and discovered from that 500 people there were 7,000 different fears. That meant it averaged 14 unique fears per person. 14. So, it's important to keep in mind that there's a lot more to fear than fear itself. And there are circumstances that are fearful. There are situations that are fearful. There are problems that are overwhelming and fearful. We all deal with them. I want to ask you to turn your Bibles to John chapter 6, the Gospel of John chapter 6. If you didn't bring a Bible with you, there's one in the back of a chair close to where you're sitting. I'd certainly encourage you to get it out and open it up. And we're going to be looking at this passage. Now, before I began reading verse 16, I want to read verse 14 because it is the wrap-up of the most famous miracle that Jesus performed. In fact, of all the miracles he performed, raising people from the dead, and all those other things, no miracle had more impact nor was more widely understood and known than the feeding of the 5,000. When that miracle occurred, this is what happens, and look at verse 14. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is a prophet who has come to the world." Jesus, knowing they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew to a mountain by himself. Now that statement right there tells us that Jesus clearly knew that they misunderstood why he came. They clearly misunderstood what he was going to do. They clearly misunderstood where his kingdom was. And so he withdraws. And another gospel account tells us that Jesus then sent the disciples by boat across the Sea of Galilee. Now, the Sea of Galilee is just a little lake, about 12, 14 miles long, about 6 miles wide. So, I've been there 8 times, and we'll be going there a 9th time real soon. And, the bottom line is it's not very big. But it also has, mountain ranges around it. And at one point, those mountain ranges are broken up by 2 very sheer cliffs that have a gap of probably about 400 or 500 yards in between them. And that creates like a wind tunnel effect on that little lake, which is like 600 feet below sea level as it is. And I've actually seen it when it had like 3-foot waves on it. And they're in this little old rickety boat. They're in the middle of the lake. It is dark. It is difficult. It is frightening. It is scary. And I want you to listen to how it's described, starting with verse 16 of John chapter 6. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and look what it says, and they were terrified. Terrified sounds like a little worse case of fear than just being afraid. But he said to them, "It is I." Now, if you read that in the Greek text, which it was written in, it is a statement that Jesus is making. And he makes it all through the Gospel of John. And he says, "It is I am." You know where that comes from? Clear back in the Old Testament, whenever Moses was taking care of his father-in-law's sheep in the middle of the desert, and he saw this bush that was burning but not being consumed by the fire. And whenever he starts approaching that bush, God speaks to him from the bush, and what does he say? He says, "Take your sandals off, you're on holy ground." And then he has this message for him. "I want you to go to the king of Egypt. I want you to tell him to set the Hebrew slaves free." And Moses looks at him and says, or looks at the bush and says, "Who can I tell him sent me?" And this is what he says. "Tell him that I am has sent you." A brand new revelation of God. It is the revelation of God that we know of as Yahweh, or sometimes mistranslated Jehovah. But the reality is this, that God was revealing himself now as the God who is engaged in the daily affairs of his people. And that's exactly what you see him doing as he leads the children of Israel out of Egyptian slavery. He then leads them into the land of promise. Over and over again, he demonstrates he is the God who is engaged in their daily affairs. Then, in John's gospel account, he records the number of times that Jesus makes this self-revelation of himself. Whenever he says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," he's saying, Yahweh is who I am, and I am the way, the truth, and the life. Every time he's around the Pharisees and he made that statement, they went ballistic because they understood He was claiming to be the same Jehovah, Yahweh God, that appeared to Moses in the burning bush. And it made them go crazy when they heard him making those statements. So he says, they're terrified. He says, I am. So don't be afraid. It's I am. The God who makes things happen is with you. And they were willing to take him into the boat. Immediately the boat reached the shore where they were headed. And so I'm in Capernaum. I'm going to look for that kill mark along the edge of the Sea of Galilee. See if it's still there. You know it isn't anyway. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the fears they experienced are the same kinds of fears that you and I deal with in our lives. And they're very real, and they're very, very debilitating for all of us when we experience it. In fact, I was reading a while back where they did a study many years ago of elementary age students, and they asked them what their 5 greatest fears were. And so many years ago, the 5 greatest fears of elementary age school children was animals, dark rooms, strangers, high places, and loud noises. Recently, they did a similar study of elementary students, and they asked them what their 5 top fears were, and this is what they are: parents divorcing, nuclear war, getting cancer, pollution, getting mugged or molested. Now, things have changed, and with it has changed a lot of fears that we deal with. And Jesus is there with us during those times and wants us to understand that when he's brought into the equation, he says, when I am is here, don't be afraid. And that's what he would say to all of us this morning. Before I look at John chapter 6, there's a few things I want to share with you that I think help us to better understand this whole issue of fear and how it affects our lives. And I'd like to start, first of all, by identifying the things that cause fear. What are the things that cause fear in our lives? Well, the very first thing is worry is caused by fear. If you find yourself full of anxiety and worry, it is simply because there's something you are afraid of. Now, God, in all of his creation, only gave to men and women the capacity to imagine things, the ability to see things that do not yet exist, and from that understanding, create things that are pretty amazing at times. Now, Karen and I have this little dog named Rusty who lives with us, or we live with him, or something, I'm not sure. Anyway, Rusty, I think Rusty would have above average doggy intelligence. I mean, good lands, we wouldn't have him if he didn't. And you know, Rusty has the ability to communicate. He really does. I mean, he wants his belly scratched. He has a way of letting you know that. If he wants something to eat, he has a way of letting you know that. And he has a pretty good ability to communicate. Now, he hasn't started speaking English yet, but he's pretty smart. And but I have yet to have Rusty come to me and say, "Hey, Papa, I had this idea," because he has no ability to imagine things. All he can do is respond to you and and to you and to me and whoever's a part of his world. He can respond to us. He can let us know what he likes and doesn't like. But there's not. Have you ever seen a building that a dog created? No. Have you ever seen a car that a dog built? No. The reality is they have lots of great capabilities, but they do not have the capacity to imagine. That is a wonderful gift, because that gift of imagination enables us to see things that don't yet exist. I mean, you're sitting in a building right now that I know where the idea of it came from, all right? And the reality is, imagination has the ability to see things that do not yet exist. That is a wonderful thing on a positive side. On a negative side, that is a terrifying thing. You know why? Because you can imagine things that don't exist, and yet you worry yourself and you become fearful of things that don't exist, because that's the power of imagination. Someone said, and I think it's so very, very true, they said an imaginary fear may be unreal, but a fearful imagination is very real. All you got to do is ask somebody that has one. And I can tell you that it's important to keep in mind that things that cause fear in our lives, worry is caused by fear, and it has all kinds of negative effect on our lives. Guilt causes fear. You know, whenever we disobey God and lose close fellowship with Him, you know, that spiritual loneliness creates fear in our lives. You remember whenever Adam and Eve disobeyed and they partook of the forbidden fruit, and God comes in the cool of the day to have conversations with them like He's been having ever since He created them. He comes and Adam is nowhere to be found. And so He calls out and He says, Adam, where are you? And Adam says, here I am. And He said, what's going on? He says, I was afraid, so I what? Hid. I was afraid and I hid. As if God, the Creator God, didn't know where He was at the whole time. And yet many of us do exactly the same thing. We find ourselves doing something that we know violates God's principles, and we deal with incredible guilt over whatever it is that we're dealing with in our lives. And then it causes us to think that we can hide certain aspects from God. We can hide certain aspects of our lives from other people. Let me remind you that the old psalmist said, he said this, what I did in secret and I thought I'd hidden from everybody has been shouted from the rooftops. And I think it's important to keep in mind that you can hide, but eventually you will be found out. And guilt causes us amazing fear in our lives. And then wrong motives cause fear. You know, in 1 John 4:18, the same John, who's the human author of the Gospel of John, is the human author of 1 John. And this is what he says. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and he who fears is not perfected in love. I think that what later John came to understand was that because the disciples were really following Jesus for overall wrong motivations, they thought He was going to set up an earthly kingdom. They thought they would be people of significance with positions of power and influence in that kingdom. Because of that, their focus was where? Horizontal. That's where it was. Now let me remind you, Jesus has just performed a few hours before this experience on the Sea of Galilee, has performed what? The greatest miracle that He ever performed whenever He fed the 5,000 people. They have seen His amazing power at work. They know what He can do. They have seen Him do those kinds of things. And yet, in the middle of the circumstances they're in, all they can see are waves, darkness, and all the other things associated with that. And it's important to keep in mind that whenever we deal with these kinds of things in our lives, that wrong motivations cause fear. So if your focus is on yourself and on your own personal agendas, then you're going to be afraid a lot of the time. And then the unknown causes fear. We get afraid because we don't really know what is going on. And we're confused by all those things over the horizons or around the next corner or beyond the next valley that we can't see beyond. We get so afraid of the things that we cannot see and who cannot know the outcomes to. And then the uncontrollable causes fear. I mean, how many of us like to be in control? And anytime we feel like things are spinning out of our control, then it causes all kinds of fear and anxiety. But the root cause of fear is unbelief. In Isaiah 12:2, the prophet says, "Behold," pay attention to this, "God is my salvation. I will trust and I will not be afraid." Now that's an important thing to keep in perspective. Whenever we understand, he says, God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. That's exactly what I've said many, many times, talking about fear and faith. Fear and faith can never coexist in your life. When fear walks in what door? The front door? Well, it walks out the back door. Faith does. When faith walks in the front door, fear walks out the back door. And that's exactly what Isaiah is saying. He says, I will trust, and when I trust, I'm not afraid. That's critically important for all of us. So fear, we have to make a decision, is either going to cause us to focus on all of the horizontal negatives in our world, in our lives, or fear will cause us to trust in a God who is in absolute control, a God who is able to do what everyone else says is impossible. But I think it's not only important to understand the things that cause fear before I look at John chapter 6. I think it's also important to recognize the damage that fear does in our lives. Fear paralyzes our potential. Fear causes us to miss, because of that, unbelievable opportunities in our lives. And it keeps us from doing more with our lives, because fear paralyzes the potential we have. Now, my dad was a pastor, and we lived in a house that was owned by the church, and those were called parsonages. And it was a very nice house, and a very large house, and a very comfortable house. And yet my dad knew that they would never accumulate any net worth unless they were able to buy a place of their own. So he would occasionally go looking at some houses around. And I can remember him taking my mom to show her some houses. And every time he would, Mom would like the house. But when it came to actually taking the step of purchasing the house, she let her fears override my dad's logic and override his understanding of the financial realities of life. And it kept them from ever purchasing a house. And I think intuitively my dad knew that they needed to do that. He had no premonition he was going to die prematurely. That's pretty obvious to all of us. But I think intuitively he knew he needed to do that. But because of my mom's fear of taking that step, after Dad died, my mom ended up living in a mobile home for 36 years until she moved in with Karen and I 3 years before she died. Now, there was nothing wrong with her mobile home. It was kept in great shape and in great order, and she kept it comfortable, and she kept it very nice. But had she not let fear override the vision my dad had for that, things would have been very, very different just from that aspect in her life. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind that you and I miss one opportunity after another in life because we simply are controlled by our fears. Paul Tournier wrote a book, and that book is entitled, The Strong and the Weak. And this is what he says. All of us have reservoirs of full potential, vast areas of great satisfaction. But the roads that lead to those reservoirs are guarded by the dragon of fear. And that is such an incredibly insightful perspective on it, because every one of us have this vast reservoir of unbelievable potential in our lives. And the thing that keeps us from realizing that vast potential that God has for us, are the dragons of fear that keep us from taking the right next step and doing the next right thing and advancing in the next right way and taking advantage of the next right opportunity. You know, we have a couple of church buses, and those buses will drive you crazy if you're going very far on an interstate, because they've got governors on them for like 62 miles an hour. Now, maybe you love putzing down the interstate at 62. That's not the way I like to go down the interstate. You can leave the rest of it to your own imagination. But putzing along at 62 is not my idea of making time. And those buses, without those, without those governors, could probably do 90 miles an hour, but that wouldn't be a good idea. But those motors are big enough, those motors are strong enough to push one of those buses down the road a whole lot faster than 62, but because it's got a governor on it, it doesn't matter how much power that engine has, because it is not going faster than what? 62. And it's important to keep in mind, that's exactly what fear does. It's like a governor on your life. You may have that reservoir of unbelievable potential, but that governor stops you from experiencing your full potential in life. And that's what fear's doing to far too many of us in this room. And God says, I've got something so much better for you than you can imagine or think. And that's why it's so important to understand that fear is really like a self-imposed prison. They normally lock prison doors from which side? The outside. Isn't that correct? But whenever you let fear take over your life, you lock yourself in a prison from the inside. Nobody can get you out of that prison except who? You and God. That's the only one that can get you out of that prison, because you lock yourself in that prison. It's a self-imposed, self-locked down situation that you're in, all because of fear in your life. And then fear, not only does it, paralyze our potential, but fear ruins relationships. The greatest block to intimacy in a marriage or a friendship or any other relationship is fear. Fear causes us to cover up. Fear causes us to wear a mask. Fear causes us not to say what we really are thinking. We pretend we're somebody that we're not. And all of that causes us to live a lie. And I'm just convinced that many of us will never experience meaningful relationships in marriage, and a meaningful relationship in our marriage, because we simply block intimacy by not being authentic. Now, I do quite a few marriage ceremonies, and when I do, I always tell a couple that about 50% of what I'm going to talk to you about, I talk to virtually every couple about. The other 50% is pretty much tailored to the unique components of your relationship. So part of the 50% I talk to every couple about is really based on Genesis 2. After God has created Eve and brings her to Adam, this is what he says. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother. He shall be superglued to his wife, or cling to his wife. And they shall become one flesh. That's the sexual part of it. And they were both naked. Now, in our culture, we think of nakedness as sex. No. Nakedness means there's nothing hidden. That's what it means. And every marriage that is going to be successful has to be a naked relationship where there are no hidden spots. And I always will tell a couple virtually the same thing. And that is this, that if 6 months after you're married, your husband goes, I didn't know that. And 3 months later, the wife goes, I didn't understand that. And 18 months later, those statements keep coming out. You know what? Every time that comes out, happens, it starts chiseling away at the foundation of a marriage. You know what that foundation is? It's called trust. And after a while, when there's been enough chiseling away of trust, because there's been enough things that was never put on the table. And I have people say, well, I'm not sure the engagement can survive nakedness. It's kind of like, so you think a broken engagement is more complicated than a divorce? Excuse me. Not quite. The bottom line is, if in the preparation time for marriage, the relationship can't stand the truth, putting a ring on someone's finger or in their nose, by the way, is not going to change that relationship. And they'll just feel trapped and feel deceived. And because of that, the foundation of trust is destroyed. And let me make it really clear that fear does exactly that. We're afraid that if they know the truth about us, they won't want anything to do with us. Well, let me tell you something. The Bible makes this statement, and that is this. The truth will what? Set you what? Free is what it will do. And that's something we must never, ever forget. And it also causes us to withdraw from relationships because fear keeps us from being vulnerable because we're afraid we'll be hurt again. If you haven't been hurt in a friendship or hurt in a working relationship or tragically hurt through a divorce, you haven't lived your life, because all of us experience betrayal. All of us experience hurt. All of us experience abandonment. All of us experience being taken advantage of. And fear will ruin our relationships. And then fear robs us of our happiness. Proverbs 12:25, this is what Solomon says, I'm worn out by my worries. Have you ever gotten worn out by your worries? I mean, how many of you ever done that rotisserie thing in the middle of the night? You know what I mean? I mean, you do those 360 rolls in your bed. I mean, by the time that sheet's been wrapped around you 3 times, it's time to get up and have a prayer meeting. How about that? Okay? And so worry does that. Worry robs us of our happiness in life. There's no way you can be full of fear and worry and happy at the same time. It is a contradiction in even understanding the basic essence of life. You know, fears are kind of like Alfred Hitchcock's movies. He said, I turn my fears into movies, and then they scare the daylights out of the rest of us. And I think that worry is like that. They're bad movies we just keep replaying over and over and over in our minds. And then fear sabotages our success. Job 3:25. I came across this passage, I think it was when I was still in college. And this passage has affected how I deal with fear so much. It's incredible. Now, before I share that passage with you, let me give you the background. If you remember, Job was a very wealthy guy. Job had, a wonderful family. He had lots of houses, lots of barns, lots of crops, lots of animals and livestock. I mean, this guy had everything. He had it all. And in one day, he loses it all. And not only does he lose it all, he's lost his health. He's covered with boils from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. And then his wife comes and said, we'd all be better off without you, Job. That's what she said. Curse God and die. Sounded me like she wanted him out of her life. And listen to what he says. Everything I feared and everything I dreaded has come true. Do you guys understand this? That fears are generally self-fulfilling prophecies. They're self-fulfilling prophecies. What you fear is what will happen. Another quote from the book, The Strong and the Weak. And this is what the author says. Fear creates what it fears. And I think that's a very insightful perspective. And the fear, for some of us, has become just like our dad. So we're so focused on him, what do? We become just like the old geezer. Some of you are so afraid of becoming like your mom. All you do is focus on her, and you're starting to act like the grand old dame. Bottom line is this, that whatever we focus on is whatever we then move towards. And that's the unfortunate part. So if you're focused on your fears, what are you moving towards? The very thing that you're afraid of. What does the Bible say about that? The Bible says that if we will trust God, that He can do things that we can never think of, things we can never imagine. I think there's a big trade-off between fear and faith. When we have faith to believe God will do the incredible, then what will God do? He will do the incredible. But if we're scared to death, things are going to go bad in our lives, and things are going to fall apart. We're going to lose it all. Everything's going to cave in around us. Guess what? It's going to all cave in around us. That's what will happen in our lives. I know some women who don't think they're pretty enough, so they try to look like Tammy Faye. Woo! And you know, the fear of losing your spouse causes you to act in a way sometimes just drives them away. We all do that. And I just think it's important to keep in mind, there are people I know that are so afraid of poverty that they make risky investments that lead them to what? Poverty is what it does. So let me just challenge us today to understand that fear sabotages what in our lives? Sabotages. Now I want you to look at John chapter 6. Because from this, there's some very important things that we see illustrated about how God can work in our lives. So the basis of our hope is in Jesus' response to our fears. What's the very first thing? When Jesus knows that you're going through a fearful time, remember this, Jesus is watching us. In John's account of this, it says that Jesus went to a mountain. When he realized they were wanting to take him and make him king by force, he goes to a mountain. Another gospel account says that he was on the mountain watching the disciples, struggling in these high waves, these strong winds. So he is watching us. And the key thing for us to keep in mind is that he's totally aware of whatever it is that is going on in your lives. Not only is he totally aware, he has not forgotten you. He sent the disciples from the one side of the lake to the other side of the lake. He didn't forget them just because they're in the middle of the lake, by themselves, struggling to make any kind of progress, struggling with the wind, and struggling with the waves, and struggling with keeping water bailed out of that little rickety boat. He is completely aware of where they're at. He knows what is going on. And he wants to teach us that when we feel like we're up against it, he is aware that he makes every path in our life easy street, because generally it isn't. What he wants us to be aware of is when we're going through those valleys of the shadow of death, he is there. When we're going through the rocky, difficult places, he is there. Whenever we're in the storms of life, he is there. He is watching us, and he's aware of whatever it is that's going on in your life. And not only does he watch us, but John 6 teaches us that Jesus will come. Jesus doesn't watch with serene detachment. He knows that when we hit the end of our own strength, generally that's whenever we start trusting him and calling out to him. And I'm not sure why we have to wear ourselves out before we get there. But he knows when we're there, and he promises he will come. Repeatedly, he assures us of his care, of concern. He reminds us he knows the numbers of the hairs on your head. He knows when sparrows fall. He knows everything that is going on. He is deeply, deeply concerned about it. He sees us, and he comes. But he does something else. Jesus will help. Through his earthly ministry, Jesus demonstrated that when people were facing impossible circumstances, he would do what they could not do, that he will help. He comes to Jairus, whose daughter has died, and he says, don't be afraid, just believe. His words to his disciples immediately following the resurrection is, do not be afraid. And he comes to every one of us, whatever the circumstances we're in, and he says to us, do not be afraid. And then Jesus, John 6, teaches us, brings us to a safe place. John, in his account, says it seems like that when we invited Jesus into the boat, now keep in mind that it tells us they were 3.5 miles out. That means they were halfway across this little lake. But it seemed to John like that whenever they invited Jesus into the boat, that immediately the keel of the boat was scraping the beach at Capernaum. And I would just, again, point out to all of us that when God responds, the God who makes things happen, the great I am, responds to our needs, it is then that he brings us to a very safe place. Whenever we were pastoring in Montgomery, Alabama many years ago, somebody gave me an old boat. Now, it's probably an old boat that I should have just taken to the dump somewhere. But because I have the ability to use these things, I was able to take that old boat and fix it up. And so my boys and I would go out fishing, and Karen would go with us sometimes. And my mom was visiting us. And now, keep in mind, this is a 14-foot little old fiberglass bass boat. It's not anything, I mean, it was a long ways from fancy. It really was. Long ways from it. And a boat that probably had a maximum capacity of 2 or 3 people. It had me, my wife, my mom, and our 2 boys. Now, they were only like maybe 8 or 9 years old at that time, so they weren't that big. There were 5 of us on this little tiny boat. We were out fishing on Lake Jordan, which is a beautiful little lake just north of Montgomery. And you know, the south central part of Alabama, they have summer afternoon thunderstorms like we have here. I mean, the sky gets black as tar, the wind blows like crazy, lightning flashing and thunder rolling, and the wind blowing. And so here we are, 2 or 3 miles from the dock, and it is just coming down. I still remember how relieved I was when we pulled up to the dock, and I was able to get, and by the way, my mom was not only afraid of buying houses, she was scared to death of the water. So I still remember how relieved I was to get her and my wife and my boys off of that boat and get it on the trailer and head back to Montgomery. You know, all I'm trying to say is this. There is an amazing thing that happens whenever we're in a dangerous place, a frightful and scary place, and we're brought to a what? Safe place. And you may be in the middle of a dangerous, scary, frightening place. And whenever Jesus is brought into the equation, what will he do? He will bring you to what kind of place? A safe place is where he'll bring you. And that's very important for us not to forget. And then I want to wrap things up by identifying the way hope helps us to overcome our fears. When our hope is in God, it gets our eyes off of ourselves. See, there's no problem too big for God to solve. No burden too heavy for him to carry. No battle too big for him to win. Over and over again we understand that. You remember the 10 spies, or the 12 spies went in to spy out the promised land? 10 of them come back, and what do they say? It's a land with milk and honey. It's a land of abundance. But it's also a land of great walled cities. It's a land that is inhabited by giants with mighty armies. And we were like, what? Grasshoppers. Now, Joshua and Caleb come back, see the same things, and here's what they say. It's a land with gigantic walls. It's a land with gigantic people. And it's a land with powerful armies. But our God has promised to give it to us, so those walls are not too high for him to go over. Those giants are not too big for him to defeat. And God will give us what he's promised us. Let me just encourage us. When our focus shifts from what I call the horizontal to the vertical, it changes our perspective on all of these things. Had the spies, those 10 spies, had eyes that could see above the gigantic walls and the gigantic people and the powerful armies, they would have realized that their God was more powerful and was bigger than any situation they were dealing with. So when our hope is in God, it gets our eyes off ourselves and our abilities and on God and his abilities. And I would just say this, that if you're focused on how big your problem is, it's because you're focused then on the wrong thing. Get your focus off of how big your problem is and start focusing on how big your God is. And when you do that, it changes everything in your life. And because our hope is in an all-knowing God, we can give our fears to him. See, he knows the beginning from the ending. He knows it all. So let me just encourage you. You know, of those 14 unique fears that you have in your life that I talked about a few minutes ago, get your little list out. Start listing out the things you're most afraid of. Start just listing them out. And then what I would want to encourage you to do is turn those fears over to God. Say, God, this list belongs to you. You are bigger than any fear I have. You are more powerful than any problem I'm dealing with. And you're able to do unbelievable things. In Genesis 14, it's a story that most of us don't generally focus on. Abraham has done battle with 4 very powerful kings, and he won an amazing victory. That night, as he lay down to sleep, he wondered if those 4 kings were going to return and challenge him again with superior forces. And this is when God appeared to Abraham and listened to what God said to Abraham when he was afraid that the problem was going to come back. Don't be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield. And I don't know what it is that keeps popping back up in your life that causes fear. But whatever it is, listen to what God told Abraham, because he tells you and me the same thing. Don't be afraid. I am what? Your shield. I'm your defender. I'm your protector. I'm the one who's there for you. When we begin to understand that, it changes everything in our world. And then, when our hope is in God, we can disown the fear. Once we're down to the core of our fear, and please get there when you make that list out, the big question becomes, will we surrender those fears to God, or are we going to hang on to them? Do you want your life to be that miserable? See, you can let go of that list of fears. You can walk out of here in trust and confidence, faith, aware that God is at work in an amazing way in your life, and that he's going to do things you've never seen him do before. He's going to transform situations that you look at as an impossibility. He's going to change needs in your life. He's going to bring blessings in your life if you will trust him. So whenever our hope is in God, we can disown our fears. And God is asking us the same question that I think that he presented to the disciples that day. When Jesus says, "It is I am, Yahweh, don't be afraid," I think he says to us, In light of your understanding that I'm Yahweh, the God who makes things happen, how long do you feel you need to hang on to those fears? My question is, are you going to surrender them to Him? And then, because our hope is in God, we can trust His sovereignty, or the fact He's in complete control. There are new fears that you will deal with and I deal with every single day of our lives. But we don't have to live in fear even when we know that, because Jesus makes another great I am statement. And this is what He says. I am, or Yahweh, is with you always. I am with you always. Yahweh is with you always. The psalmist says, I will fear no evil because you are with me. And that's all we need to know. The Apostle John, who was the human author of the Gospel of John, is the only disciple of Jesus Christ that did not die as a martyr. But the Apostle John was dipped into a pot of boiling oil for his faith in Jesus Christ and did not die from his burns. When they realized they couldn't kill him, they then banished him to an island called Patmos, an island off the coast of Asia Minor. I've been there before. It's not some place that I would necessarily want to spend a lot of time at. So that's where he's at. He looks across the Aegean Sea towards Asia Minor and the 7 churches of Asia Minor that in just a little while the resurrected, ascended Jesus Christ is going to give him a special message for. And he finds himself deeply distressed by those churches and what's going on in them. And this is what the resurrected, ascended Jesus says. It says that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. So on a Sunday, the day of resurrection, he was in the Spirit worshiping by himself because he was there by himself. And Jesus himself gave him the revelation that we now we know as the book of Revelation. But this is what he says to John. Fear not. Fear not. And then gives him the reasons he should not fear. Listen to them. Fear not, because I am the first and the last. I know the beginning from the ending, is what he says. So fear not, because I know what is going on in your life right now. He says, fear not only am I the first and the last, but I am the living one. I died, but I rose, like I said I would. So when it looks like everything is in ashes in your life, and it looks like everything has gone in the wrong direction, remember that there's no reason to be afraid, because if I can experience that resurrection, I can resurrect whatever I want to resurrect in your life and in your circumstances too. And then keep this in mind. He says, fear not. Not only am I the first and the last and the living one, but he said, I hold the keys of death and hell in my hand. What's he saying? Some of us are scared to death of death, and we're afraid that we're not good enough to go to heaven. He says, I hold the keys to all that. If you'll just trust me, you can join the Apostle Paul in saying, oh, death, where is your sting? Oh, grave, where is your victory? And if you'll place your faith in me, I have a place called heaven prepared for you. Let me make it really, really clear. There is nothing that you and I should be afraid of. Why? Because when Jesus, the great I am, is brought into the equation, He can and will do things that will transform everything we look at as overwhelming, everything we look at as impossible, everything we look at as undoable or unchangeable. He is in the business of transforming all of that. If we let fear walk in the front door of, or faith walk in the front door of our lives and push fear out the back door. And I encourage us today just experience God working in a dynamic way in our lives. Bow your heads, please. God, we come to you right now. And we know that in this room that there are many of us who are dealing with hundreds of different kinds of fears in our lives. Whatever those fears are, we just surrender that list of fears to you today. And we ask that your Holy Spirit would work in an unbelievable way, helping us, God, to allow you to replace our fear with faith, trust, confidence in you. And when we do, we know that we'll experience hope in our lives. And so I pray today that you would do something so transforming and so amazing that we will leave here not full of fear, but full of hope, full of confidence and trust in you, and know that you have got amazing things you're going to do in the coming days in our lives. So we present ourselves, our needs, and all those things to you today, and ask you to work in a dynamic and powerful way. And then, Father, I pray for those who come here who do not have a personal relationship with you, that at this moment they would just join me and say, Jesus, thank you for dying as my substitute on the cross. I accept your gift of forgiveness. I accept your gift of grace and mercy. I accept your gift of salvation. And I believe that you are my Savior. You are my hope. You are my confidence. I invite you to take control of my life. And I surrender myself to you and want my life to be lived in a way that reflects authentic faith and trust and confidence in you. Thank you for making me a new person in you today. I ask this in your name. Amen.